We're joined, as you've seen, by Dr. Ayodele Oni, who's a partner energy practice group at Bloomfield LP. He's also a commercial lawyer. He joins us virtually this morning on the program. Dr. Oni, thank you for joining us. I want to ask how you've been grappling with this, power supply and all of that. But on a general front now, is there really a straightforward answer as to why Nigeria has had to endure years, decades of poor power supply and across the value chain? I mean, from generation, transmission, and distribution.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a hydra-headed problem. You've had that problem, mismanagement for several years. You've had a situation where you've had insufficient investments over a long period of time, until between the last time you had any major grid enhancement before the mid-2000s was 1987. And you can imagine what the population was then and what the population was in 2010, 2012, thereabout, when you began to have major improvements on the grid. So if you look at the problem, it's across the value chain. And you could put them in buckets. You've got the technical, you've got commercial, you've got the disco issues, you've got even economic and issues around implementation and even the regulator. And I can discuss each of these issues. So it's not just one problem, it's a suite of problems and issues around mismanagement and not properly maintaining infrastructure and even insufficient infrastructure. For example, the grid collapse we've had, a number of reasons can be adduced for this. First, low frequency and the fact that you have majority of the power plants in the south and you don't have sufficient power or power generation from the north. Even the power generation in the south is epileptic. So it begins to affect the system. You also have the problem with even the SCADA, what's known as the Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition System and the ENS. In every system, you need to monitor. You need to be able to anticipate that there may be a challenge. But because we do not have sufficient infrastructure, the SCADA is almost non-existent. And for a while, government has been speaking about buying a new one or replacing it. So before there is a grid collapse, before there's a problem along the network, they are supposed to see that through the SCADA. You can remotely monitor. So there are several issues and we can discuss them one by one.
Dr. Oni, is to find out exactly where this all started from. There are those who are referencing as far back as pre-privatization. There are those who are saying, well, the real problem we wanted to solve, these are some of the problems we wanted to solve when we moved NEPA into PHCN and then the privatization program and the restructuring of the power sector, so to speak, that we have, right now. So perhaps by way of backtracking, was the privatization issue a mistake, or was it something that we didn't get right from the very beginning? Should government, I don't know, as you said, it's a whole lot of issues. So one is just wondering, by way of backtracking, did we make a mistake privatizing? Or is it that it's too early for government to hand off completely?
No, there was no mistake privatizing. Now, the problem is, for me, the way the privatization went. You could see if you were doing a privatization program and you invite international investors and they don't come, then you know that there's something wrong with that structure or that system. Many of them could see from cradle to grave what the system looked like, the several years of neglect, and what it will take to get the system working. And as long as you had the transmission system still with government, a lot of them had their doubts. So the privatization was a good step, absolutely good step. The problem with Nigeria is not the idea or is not the policy, but the problem around implementation. So the privatization was done. There were issues, in my view, the way the privatization aspect of it. I think that many of the guys who bought those assets did not even have money to pay for the assets and went out borrowing. People who went out borrowing will find it difficult to even be able to expend cost to improve infrastructure that is already almost dead. That's one problem. Secondly, some of these assets, you can say they were overpriced because even the baseline numbers were wrong. Many of these guys could not undertake proper due diligence. Maybe because of labor issues, the labor guys were not letting them come in to undertake due diligence. So many people went in blindly. Some didn't exactly go in blindly, but didn't have money. So if you are borrowing 70% from the bank, the 30 or 40% you're supposed to invest as a major investor, your own equity, you go borrowing it from elsewhere. It means you've got no cash and you've got no skin in the game. So the privatization itself was an ideal, what should have been done ideally, but there were issues around how it was done, the sort of individuals who got some of those assets. So I think that's it. And this problem is historical. I mean, you had NEPA in the 70s, in the 80s, you had lack of proper investment. People saw electricity as a social good and rather steal electricity than pay for it. You had the wrong people managing. There was a story. Right. I think my dad told me a story once. The head of engineering at some point was someone who studied Yoruba or something in the university. The head of a unit in the engineering department. So, you know, it's always been so bad.
And you know, that just aligns. That just aligns with, I mean, what President said during that interview with Channels Television about the power, you know, the privatization process, saying he didn't quite understand why it went that way, why the people that got what they got them. I mean, they were not engineers anyway. In fact, he thought there were political favors and all of that. But let's get deep into this power grid collapse. I mean, because to the average Nigerian, power grid collapse, you wonder, was this grid just standing, got tired, and just collapsed? And I'm talking about this happening at a time where we're still trying to grapple with fuel scarcity. I'm talking petrol, diesel, and essentially, you just ask, how worse can it get? So how does a power grid collapse? I mean, you're in this sector, you're well versed in it. What can cause this power grid to collapse, not once, twice in 48 hours?
Okay, a number of things can cause the grid collapse. One of them is around the frequency and poor planning and scheduling and management, and I'll explain it. A grid is a system or a network of transformers, substations, transmission lines, particularly the transmission lines, substations, all of those. If there's a break, or imagine that something is supposed to even out and there's a lopsided part of it, it can cut that system. So instead of having a system where you've got power coming from the north, you've got power coming from the south, and you've got some evenness. When something is uneven, or you've got poor infrastructure somewhere, it can lead to a system cutting. I'm trying to use a layman language. So if you've got a web and a part of it cuts, it means that if power is generated somewhere, it's supposed to flow to that end. Because there's a cut, it cannot flow to that end, particularly if it needs to flow further from one end to another end. So that's how it works. And I'll tell you some of the reasons for this. One, I'd explained low frequency and the fact that you have epileptic supply from the south without having commensurate supply from the north. Two, infrastructure. You've got the SCADA, you've got the ENS. The SCADA is the supervisory control and data acquisition, which should monitor the entire system. What we have is, we have one that is almost non-existent because it's outdated and it's been malfunctioning. At the National Control Center in Osogbo, you should have those arrangements in place, because without monitoring the system and knowing that there's a problem here and you quickly resolve it, it can lead to a damage in that part, and then electricity doesn't flow. Just to explain it in a layman language. Additionally, there's a problem with implementation. We've got a strong market design. Every market should have a capacity element, an energy element, an imbalance element, and ancillary services, such as spinning reserves, black start capability, and all of those. But in implementation, many of these, because all of these work together to ensure that the system works efficiently and works well. But in practice, beyond energy and capacity, Issues around imbalance do not really exist in the market. Even the market for the ancillary services is non-existent. Because I'll give you an example of what an ancillary service does. If there's a break in transmission, there should be a power plant that can restart the system, or a couple of power plants. But that's not implemented. So we have brilliant ideas, but the problem is implementation. If you look at the laws, if you look at the grid code, you will see all of this well detailed.
We'll get into the laws, definitely, and regulation and all of that. But we're almost a decade into privatization. And I can talk about some other sectors that have been privatized. And just a few years after, you know how things improved and things continue to improve. So we have issues about load shedding, stranded power, the infrastructure you talked about. And we're still talking about these things at a time where we should be, you know, talking about other things. I mean, we had a target of 20,000 megawatts of installed capacity in 2020. This is 2022, and we're still at, what, just about 10,000 capacity. And in reality, it's way, way below all of that. So subsidy has also been removed, according to the Minister of Finance during that IMF and African Ministers of Finance conference, saying that, you know, it was a gradual thing. So essentially, you'd expect that money should be flowing more in that sector, and we shouldn't be talking about all of this. So what do we need to tighten now? Is it, in fact, let's get into the laws. Is it a law thing? Is it a regulatory thing, or what? Because if we're 10 years into, or about 10 years into privatization, and we're still talking about this, then for how long more will we keep talking about this?
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's first an implementation thing. It's not the laws. We've got brilliant laws. We've got brilliant regulations. At times, I think we even over-regulate. I think the problem is implementation. And I'll give you an example. In the power sector, you've got about 4 bands for paying for electricity tariffs. Those who have lights for up to, say, 18 hours, those who have, say, 12 hours, everyone pays a different tariff. But the discos, very often, not all of them, but some of them, do not provide power for that number of hours, yet charge for that band. So imagine you have 4 bands, 20 to 24 hours. Band A is the most expensive. Band B is 18 hours to 20 hours. Band C, much lower, and then band D, less than, say, 6 hours. But someone gets 6 hours of power, but it's charged 20 hours. You know, that's one thing. NERC needs to do more in that respect. It's not about just issuing regulations. Implementation is the problem. Secondly, even you and I, the consumer, wanting to
just
not pay or wanting to steal.
Why does that happen? Why is it a lack of capacity on the part of the discos, or the supply that they get from maybe the Gencos or the Trancos?
Okay, it's 2 things. Poor infrastructure for some of them, pure market indiscipline, and I'll tell you what I mean by market indiscipline. You know that you've got to pay your invoices, and therefore you need to supply electricity. But for reasons best known to them, they would rather issue estimated invoices than supply electricity.
Is that on that particular one? My apologies. So this is interesting and people can follow. Is there a penalty for that? You know, for estimated billing? Is it something that is against the law, so to speak?
Oh yes, there are regulations that say that caps what you can estimate. In fact, at some point, I think from April last year, you weren't allowed to estimate any longer.
So whose responsibility is it to ensure that there is a flag for that action?
That's NERC.
In other words, the NERC, the NERC, the regulator, is not doing its job. Now, still talking to the laws, you know, that Kayode, you know, asked you about the other time. There are those who are wondering, maybe the whole thing is too centralized. How about the states, at least, come in and assist at some point? We have all of these discos all over the place. Perhaps and you know, all of the infrastructure and everything are things that have been the responsibility of the federal government over the years. There is a city in this country that we know hasn't had didn't have power blink for many, many years. you know, and it is not something that is unknown. It's something that can be done. I'm almost certain that some of the infrastructure that they engaged in that particular city, it's an oil company servicing its own host community. They had to create these things themselves. So it is possible to have uninterrupted power supply. That is what that establishes. So if states were to play a role, what would be the difference? Are the laws of Nigeria against that?
Okay, good question. There's always been that constitutional debate whether states can legislate on generation, transmission, distribution. I mean, my view is that states can legislate on distribution because it's a residual matter. That said, there's a lot of conversation going on around decentralization and allowing states to legislate across the value chain. I think it's a step in the right direction. However, and for me, it's energy federalism. Each state will develop according to its capacity and use the resources it does have. For example, Enugu may use coal. Yeah, there are issues around net zero and all of that. Maybe there's clean coal technology. Other states may use resources most efficient for them. Now, the only challenge I have with that is, wouldn't we suffer the same fate? We need to understand the issues that have plagued the sector. Now, saying that you've got a behemoth, you've got a system, and then you want to break it down into several systems, you may just be replicating the same problems if you do not tackle the problems head on. Marketing discipline, consumers not wanting to pay, ministries, departments, and agencies of government owing bills, you know, those issues, even the grid, if a state does have its grid, and you've got issues around poor scheduling, poor planning, poor infrastructure, you just have 36 states, maybe one or two successful, 34, 33 states still having the same problem. So I'm not sure decentralization alone, I think that's good, and it's maybe very important. Decentralization alone, however, is insufficient without properly situating the problems and dealing with the problems specifically.
At the end of the day, you talked about the regulator not doing its job as and when it should do it, consequently making lives, you know, a little more difficult for people, you know, on the long run. This kind of collapse that we've been having, as we heard, in 48 hours, two national grid collapses. That wouldn't happen in a federalized, so to speak, to use your word, power system, would it?
Okay, good point. There are always debates around the concept known as regulatory capture. If you do have regulatory capture in any state, it will still be the same problem. Now, I haven't exactly said NERC isn't doing its job. I think that there are failings in certain aspects of its job. In terms of regulations, good regulations, some implementation, but isn't doing enough in terms of using the stick and implementation. So yes, with various states having their own regulators, if politics takes the better of regulation, you will have the same problem. So the question is whether we've completely depolitized, and I use that in quote, our regulatory regime. If we don't, it will be the same problem across board. So it's not just saying we should have several regulators across the states. It's about actually dealing with the problems head on.
Well, isn't it rather curious as well that we're having this at a time when, as I said earlier on, you know, we had petrol scarcity, diesel, the prices skyrocketing. I mean, those are the alternatives. I mean, talking about renewable energy like solar and all of that, you know how much it costs. So it's no-go area for some people. So the only option they had, they have at this time, which was, you know, power supply from government, also failed. And I recall the president in that interview again, which I'm referencing, talking about some sort of sabotage as well. And I recall that TCN said that they had unveiled this technology using the Internet of Things to properly monitor and see what's happening here and there. So is that also a consideration in all of this conversation, a possibility of sabotage at this time? Because it just, you know, beats my mind while we're having 2 collapses in 48 hours.
Well, I don't have sufficient data to say it's sabotage, to be honest. But you can't rule that out. But I don't think, I think it's the historical problems are not adequately dealing with those problems. And at times it appears like we deal with one and some other rears its ugly head. I think it's that problem beyond sabotage. There could be sabotage, but I'm not sure I'm going to lay at the doorsteps of sabotage, to be honest.
Okay. So we were talking about Consumer Protection Day. Incidentally, it was yesterday, and about that interview, the conference that the Minister of Finance was speaking at, where she talked about the gradual removal of subsidy in electricity sector. For a lot of people, it was shocking. They had, noticed it or suspected, seeing energy costs increasing and, the units they get reducing. We thought maybe they didn't quite pay attention. But hearing that officially, just hit home. Like, oh, that was what was really happening. So in terms of that removal, because hearing the vice president of IMF talking about how to go about some of these changes, there needs to be communication, there needs to be the buy-in of the people, then it needs to be commitment of government also to fiscal reforms, essentially saying there are ways to go about this. Do you think that was the best approach to removing subsidy? Now seeing that even after the removal of subsidy, it will seem that things are even getting worse.
Oh, very, very good point. The problem with that is you can't do that sort of thing in isolation. If you remove subsidy, then you need to ensure that people pay for efficiency and they pay for the actual service. And I think that's what they try to do with the band system, so that only when, and those who subsidies will be removed for completely, are those who should be in bands A and B effectively, in my view. But unfortunately, like you rightly pointed out, many of the discos still under supply and then still charge what they would have charged if they were efficient and if they supplied the power, sufficient power supply. There was sufficient power supply. So I think when policies such as these are implemented, you need to take a holistic view. So you remove subsidy, but you ensure that if there isn't power supply, no one pays. That's one of the reasons around 2015, 2016, if I recall, the capacity element, the fixed charge element was removed from what electricity distribution companies charge, so that they only get paid when they supply electricity. Now, what has made nonsense of that is estimated billing and the fact that many people still don't have their meters. So my view is that a distribution company goes to an area and says, you know what, we need to generate 12 billion from this area, and they just issue invoices to meet up that amount. You get 100 million, you get 1 million, 100,000, you get 1 million, you get 5 million. I think that's what they do, especially for areas where they do not have meters. So removal of subsidy isn't a bad thing,
right?
But I think that it shouldn't just be that.
Okay.
There should be enforcement, ensuring people only pay when there's electricity.
So we're closing in about...
Right,
we're closing about 20 seconds. I just wanted to ask this. For those who are still getting estimated billings, I know people getting above 100,000, in fact, as at this year. What should they do, if you can do that in 15 seconds?
Okay, I think they should first approach the relevant customer service unit of the distribution company. If they are not satisfied, they can then reach out to NERC, or maybe speak to their advisors, speak to their lawyers who can take it up, because they will then know the process or the procedure. So reach out to the distribution company. If you're not satisfied, reach out to NERC. NERC has got email addresses on their website, and that's one thing they seem to do quite well. If you reach out to them, they should be able to get a result. Yes. Well,
we'd like to thank you so much, Dr. Ayodele Oni, commercial lawyer and partner, Energy Practice Group, Bloomfield LP. I mean, your contributions have been quite instructive in this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we'll take another part to this conversation. You recall the regulatory part? Well, that's next in a moment. Please stay with us.